Hello, everyone. I am Lemon Wizard, and welcome to session 2 of the Our Sci-Fi Writers lecture series. Today, we're going to be talking about genre hardness. Many of you are probably already familiar with the terms soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi. For those that don't know, these terms basically exist to describe how much of a science fiction story is science and how much of it is fiction. Less realistic works are described as being softer, while more realistic works are described as being harder. A comment I have heard several people make is that they're concerned they're not qualified to write science fiction because they don't know enough about science. This is not true. You don't need to be an expert in science to write science fiction, and in fact, there are a huge number of successful published works whose writers clearly understood nothing and did not even care. So long as you understand the basic principles of physics on the level that they're explained in Bill Nye the Science Guy episodes, and you're willing to occasionally look things up on Wikipedia, you can make it work. The very softest genre of sci-fi is what we call space fantasy, where the setting is not intended to be speculative or plausible at all, and explicitly takes place in a world where the laws of reality are different. Perhaps the most famous space fantasy is Star Wars, where the Force is literally magic, the protagonists are mystical chosen ones, and the story spends much more time talking about things like prophecy and destiny than anything engineering related. Advanced technology exists, but no serious attempt is made to explain it, nor is any detail established about the logistics of the galactic economy. This is because none of the conflicts in Star Wars are actually determined by technological advancement or efficient resource management. Conflicts in Star Wars are determined by the will of the Force. Darth Vader even directly states this in the original film when he warns the Imperial officers not to be too proud of the Death Star because their technological terror is insignificant compared to the power of the Force. A moon-sized battle station is the ultimate representation of the Empire's superior engineering and resources over the rebellion, and Luke pretty much just flies right up to it in a dinky fighter without taking a single hit from what must be millions of cannons, and destroys the whole Death Star in one shot. The Force was with Luke, and no matter how much power the Empire brought to bear, he was always going to win. It's divine intervention. David was always going to beat Goliath. The scientific inaccuracies of Star Wars are mostly just ignored because it's so obviously a supernatural myth. It doesn't have to follow the laws of the real world because it very explicitly isn't the real world. Now, in soft sci fi, many things happen which are just as unrealistic as you'd see in space fantasy, but with the key difference that the setting claims to be governed by real world physical laws. For most soft sci fi, the word claims is doing some pretty serious heavy lifting here. Impossible things like faster than light travel don't follow the laws of physics, but in soft science fiction, there will be Technobabble explaining how some imaginary effect allows us to conveniently ignore the laws of physics and zoom around in space anyway. These explanations are always either nonsense, or in many cases, no explanation is provided at all. In Star Trek, the writers are aware of the fact that inertia is a thing, and if the Enterprise is traveling thousands of times the speed of light when it flies at warp, slowing down from that velocity to something below light speed in just a few seconds is going to kill the whole crew by smashing them into the nearest bulkhead. So, what's the solution for this? Inertial dampeners. What do? Well, they dampen inertia, of course. How inertial dampeners work is never explained at all. The writers knew inertia would be a problem in faster than light travel, so they just say, actually, no, it isn't. The internal dampeners have no more scientific justification than Jedi do when they move things around using the Force. You can literally call these things the death preventers for how little explanation they get. Inertial dampeners exist so that the writers can say, yes, nerds, I do know how inertia works, but I'm never actually going to take inertia into account because I dampened it, so shut up. Even when explanations are provided for technologies in soft sci-fi, they are generally dominated by the verbose yet meaningless type of dialogue that we call technobabble. Star Trek also features an incredible device called the replicator, which is literally able to transform energy into matter and can instantly produce almost any object a person might need, from food to medicine to tools to weapons. We say almost any object because every time there's some valuable item required to resolve the episode's plot, there will always be a line saying, we can't replicate this because of X and such. There is one episode of Star Trek in which Data explains the replicator to a passenger who's never seen one before. His explanation is something to the effect of the isolinear processing matrix calculates the optimum distribution of particles to accurately assemble the specified pattern. Now, breaking this line down, isolinear processing matrix is Star Trek for computer. And optimum distribution of particles to accurately assemble the pattern basically just means the atoms are moved into the correct position to form the chosen molecule. The verbosity of the sentence disguises how meaningless it is, because if you spoke in simple language, everyone would notice that the molecule assembler works by having a computer assemble the molecules isn't actually explaining anything to us. If you pay attention in soft science fiction, you will quickly notice that a huge number of Technobabble lines are literally just a basic description of what the device does, but dressed up with a lot of big words to make it appear more complicated. From a scientific perspective, the replicator does something even more incredible than anything we see Jedi do with the Force, and the technical explanation is ultimately meaningless. So, why bother with Technobabble if it's just nonsense to dress up something that is functionally like magic anyway? Well, it's because magic and technology have wildly different social implications, and many sci fi stories are written with a desire to delve into the social implications of technological advancement. Despite the replicator's seemingly magical function, Star Trek clearly establishes that this device is not magic and is, in fact, the product of advanced scientific and engineering knowledge. Even if we don't know how the technology works, merely establishing that it is technology is very important in this setting. This is because Star Trek is supposed to be a potential future for the real life Earth, one which is governed by real world physics and regularly references real world history. The United Federation of Planets is intended as a symbol of how humans can become better than they currently are. Giving our characters magical abilities that real people don't have and can't have would seriously undermine the message, because the idea that a utopia like the Federation could be achieved by regular humans like you and me just through hard work and compassion is the whole point of the series. So even though the technology basically functions like magic, the fact that it is technology and is produced by scientists is an important component of the story. In this way, Star Trek is the opposite of Star Wars. Engineering, logistics, and government bureaucracy absolutely have massive impacts on the outcome of events. And ultimately, this is the core of the difference between space fantasy and soft sci fi. Replicators and transporters and warp drive are actually bending reality a lot harder than a telekinetic push or shooting lighting out of your hands, but soft sci fi seeks to specifically establish that these things are technological and not mystical, and the narrative takes efforts to paint these technologies with a veneer of plausibility. Understand that technobabble is not an explanation. It is the illusion of an explanation. You are never going to write dialogue that convincingly explains how warp drive works, and that is because warp drive does not work. When Geordi talks about the warp core, the purpose of that dialogue is not to make the viewers understand warp mechanics. The purpose of that dialogue is to establish that Geordi understands warp mechanics. He is the chief engineer and he knows how to solve this problem with science and hard work. That's his job and his role in the plot. Geordi might say, the housing of the intermix chamber was damaged by impact stress, and there may be a leak in the antimatter injector if we start the warp reaction without replacing it. Or Geordi might say, a power overload burned out so many relays in the EPS grid that we can't transfer warp power to the nacelles until we replace the primary conduits. Now, ultimately, both of these statements have the exact same impact on the plot, which is that the ship is broken and Geordi needs time to fix it before they can go anywhere. However, if Geordi just said, the ship is broken every single episode, that would not make Geordi seem like a genius warp engineer. To establish the character's technical expertise, the problems he solves need to be complex. And to make sure the dialogue doesn't feel lazy and repetitive, the complex problems need to be different every time. Without technobabble, you'd have an engineer who never discusses the engine. This all stands in stark contrast to hard sci fi, where there is no technobabble at all. Either you give an explanation that's true, or you don't give an explanation at all, and even the unexplained things have to be plausible. Well researched hard sci fi is much less common than soft sci fi, specifically because it does require the writer to have a detailed understanding of all the science involved. Writing hard sci fi requires extensive research and is generally much more difficult than writing soft sci fi. A book like Andy Weir's The Martian is a great example of hard sci fi. Weir accurately depicts realistic space travel and accurately depicts the conditions on Mars and thoroughly researches everything. All the events that happen obey the laws of physics, and the future technology has no incredible breakthroughs that change the nature of space travel. Hard science fiction generally takes place in the near future, where technology is not substantially different from the present day, because, generally speaking, making up new technologies is an action that inherently makes your setting softer every time you do it. It's also not a binary decision between two separate genres either. There are works that are clearly hard, and there are works that are clearly soft, but there's also a huge spectrum of works that occupy all positions in between. I like to affectionately refer to some of my own work as non Newtonian fluid sci fi because it makes more sense the less time you spend thinking about it. You can have both hard and soft elements in the same story and blend them together well enough that they seem perfectly natural alongside one another. A common example of this is many stories will have humans use technology that's grounded and plausible, making the setting seem hard, but then aliens show up with incredible unexplained technologies that are totally unrealistic. Since the story is from the perspective of the humans, no hand waving or technobabble is needed. It's advanced alien technology that the protagonists haven't even begun to study. They don't understand it either. Your characters can even directly acknowledge that the alien technology is doing things that defy the laws of physics as we understand them. The key to blending hard and soft elements, ultimately, is to spend a lot of time talking about the hard stuff and actively avoid discussing the soft stuff. Knowing when to shut up is a very important skill for maintaining sci fi plausibility. Also, just because the mechanism of a technology is impossible does not mean we can't realistically describe the effects of that technology. Consider artificial gravity, which is a very popular trope, largely because movies and TV are shot on Earth and simulating weightlessness is expensive. Now, most settings do not put any thought into artificial gravity. It pretty much always only affects the ship itself, and the moment you go outside, you need magnet boots to stop floating away. Except the force of gravity is not stopped by walls, and these people are only 1 or 2 meters farther away from the gravity source than the crew inside. Is there artificial anti gravity built into the hull of the ship? It would seem like there has to be, because otherwise, two ships with artificial gravity would fall into each other if they got close. Artificial gravity could draw in micrometeors and other objects, accelerating them to dangerous speeds. To feel like Earth's gravity, it would have to actually be producing as much gravity as Earth, which means the ship's planet sized gravity well will change the orbit of all the worlds you visit. Without some way to block the artificial gravity, such a technology would actually be wildly impractical for space travel. So, if you write a story that talks about and explores all the actual problems that artificial gravity would cause and the additional technologies that would be needed to make it usable like it is in the movies, you've drastically increased the realism of your unrealistic technology. You haven't explained how to make artificial gravity, but you have realistically explored what it would be like if you could. Doing things like this basically allows you to take soft elements and harden them. Keeping the description vague is essential to good technobabble because every time you specify a detail, that becomes one more thing you can be wrong about. Numbers are the enemy. Never, ever say a number unless it is actually supported by research and real math. Whatever you estimate is going to be wrong, and it is only a matter of time before real science demonstrates that. In fact, it's sort of inevitable that most science fiction works will decay into being softer over time. Frankenstein was written in 1828. At the time, electricity was still poorly understood. Everyone knew that lightning bolts had incredible power, and the idea that this energy was actually everywhere and could be harnessed was the exciting wave of the future. Luigi Galvani's experiments provided the first evidence of bioelectricity in 1780, and further studies over the subsequent decades proved that electricity was the energy which operated the nervous systems of all animals. So, Mary Shelley took the recent discovery that electricity is the energy which fuels the reactions of life and imagined that perhaps it might be possible to restore life to a dead body if a large enough amount of electricity could be applied. In reality, cellular biology is much more complicated than that, but the theory of cellular biology was not actually developed until 1839, 11 years after Frankenstein was written. For Mary Shelley, explaining amazing things by crediting the power of electricity was pretty much exactly the same thing that modern writers are doing when they slap the word quantum on things to make them seem high tech. Except now it's 200 years later, and any elementary school child who watches the electricity episode of the Magic School Bus will learn more about electromagnetism in 30 minutes than any scientist on Earth knew in 1828. Electricity is no longer mysterious, and the inaccuracy of Frankenstein is obvious to a vastly greater degree than it was at the time of the book's writing. 200 years from now, when quantum mechanics are fully understood, all the current technobabble about quantum this and quantum that is going to age just as poorly. Ultimately, you decide how hard your setting is going to be based on what you want your story to be about. Both hard and soft sci fi can make great stories when done properly. Literature is ultimately about people, and you craft your setting's technology in ways that help to support your story's human themes. It's my hope to see people sharing both hard and soft story ideas on our sci fi writers, so please feel free to come by and post about your ideas and goals. Next week's topic is going to be galaxy building. We'll talk about how the Fermi paradox isn't actually a paradox, and how the Drake equation is useless for real astronomers, but actually a fantastic tool for sci fi writers. Thank you all for watching. I know your time is precious, and I'm honored you chose to spend it listening to me.